Comments on 2 Samuel, chapter 12, verses 1 to 14. David's conviction of guilt led to his salvation. The prophet Nathan's parable of the ewe lamb given to King David may be studied by all. The light was flashed sharply upon the king while he was in utter darkness as to what was thought of his actions in regard to Uriah. While he was following his course of self-indulgence and commandment-breaking, the parable of a rich man who took from a poor man his one ewe lamb was presented before him. But the king was so completely wrapped in his garments of sin that he did not see that he was the sinner. He fell into the trap, and with great indignation he passed his sentence upon another man, as he supposed, condemning him to death. When the application was made and the facts brought home to him, when Nathan said, "Thou art the man, unknowingly thou hast condemned thyself," David was overwhelmed. He had not one word to say in defense of his course of action. This experience was most painful to David, but it was most beneficial. But for the mirror which Nathan held up before him, in which he so clearly recognized his own likeness, he would have gone on unconvicted of his heinous sin and would have been ruined. The conviction of his guilt was the saving of his soul. He saw himself in another light as the Lord saw him, and as long as he lived he repented of his sin. Letter 17, 1897. David offered no excuses. David awakens as from a dream. He feels the sense of his sin. He does not seek to excuse his course or palliate his sin as did Saul, but with remorse and sincere grief he bows his head before the prophet of God and acknowledges his guilt. David did not manifest the spirit of an unconverted man. If he had possessed the spirit of the rulers of the nations around him, he would not have borne from Nathan the picture of his crime before him in its truly abominable colors, but would have taken the life of the faithful reprover. But notwithstanding the loftiness of his throne and his unlimited power, his humble acknowledgment of all with which he was charged is evidence that he still feared and trembled at the word of the Lord. Spiritual Gifts, Volume 1, page 378 and 381. Verse 25. Failure to sense need leads to presumption. Solomon's youth was illustrious because he was connected with heaven and made God his dependence and his strength. God had called him Jedediah, which interpreted being the beloved of God. He had been the pride and hope of his father and well beloved in the sight of his mother. He had been surrounded by every worldly advantage that could improve his education and increase his wisdom. But on the other hand, the corruption of court life was calculated to lead him to love amusement and the gratification of his appetite. He never felt the want of means by which to gratify his desires and never had need to exercise self-denial. Notwithstanding all these objectionable surroundings, the character of Solomon was preserved in purity during his youth. God's angel could talk with him in the night season, and the divine promise to give him understanding and judgment and to fully qualify him for his responsible work was faithfully kept. In the history of Solomon, we have the assurance that God will do great things for those who love him, who are obedient to his commandments and trust him as their surety and strength. Many of our youth suffer shipwreck in the dangerous voyage of life because they are self-confident and presumptuous. They follow their inclinations and are allured by amusements and indulgence of appetite till habits are formed which become shackles impossible for them to break and which drag them down to ruin. If the youth of our day would, like young King Solomon, feel their need of heavenly wisdom and seek to develop and strengthen their higher faculties and consecrate them to the service of God, their lives would show great and noble results and bring pure and holy happiness to themselves and many others. H.R. April 1978, chapter 16, verses 10 and 11. David accepted humiliation as necessary. David thus acknowledges before his people and chief men that this is the punishment God has brought upon him because of his sin, which has given the enemies of the Lord occasion to blaspheme, that the enraged Benjamite might be accomplishing his part of the punishment predicted, and that if he bore these things with humility, the Lord would lessen his affliction and turn the curse of Shimei into a blessing. David does not manifest the spirit of an unconverted man. He shows that he has an experience in the things of God. He manifests the disposition to receive correction from God, and in confidence turns to him as his only trust. God rewards David's humble trust in him by defeating the counsel of Ahithophel and preserving his life. Spiritual Gifts, Volume 1, page 383, chapter 19, verses 16 and 18 to 23. Shimei confessed, David forgave. After the death of Solomon, God turned the hearts of Israel as the heart of one man to David. Shimei, who had cursed David in his humility, through fear of his life, was among the first of the rebellious to meet David on his return to Jerusalem. He made confession of his rebellious conduct toward David. Those who witnessed his abusive course urged David not to spare his life because he cursed the king's anointed. But David rebuked them. He not only spared the life of Shimei, but mercifully forgave him. Had David possessed a revengeful spirit, he could readily have gratified it by putting the offender to death. Spiritual Gifts, Volume 1, page 384.